Do we have too many Linux distributions? In many ways, I really think we do. Now, we want more than one. Some people say we have to sit down and come up with one distribution and have all of us get behind it, and then we can really finally take over Windows. The problem with that, as we'll get to later, is it produces something rife for abuse and something rife for a bad philosophy. Again, we'll discuss that a little bit later on. But in this video today, I want to talk about what is too many Linux distributions and what would make a good distribution going forward as we examine all of the various elements of what makes a distribution, what are the distributions, why do we have so many distributions. So we're going to go ahead and talk about those over the course of the next few minutes. So the first thing we want to do is we want to talk about the various different Linux distribution bases. And these are really the ones which most distributions are based out of. And what we'll see is each one of them has a slightly different philosophy. So Debian, of course, is one of the most popular. Debian is based on a free-only model that does have some means to have non-free software in it, but it's very easy to turn those on or off. And the latest iteration of Debian also carries with it the ability to turn on or off free software as far as the drivers separate from the software itself. So if you want to say, I'll allow the proprietary drivers to make sure the video card works, but I don't want to allow the proprietary drivers, like the proprietary software for software packages, you can do those separately now. But ultimately, the philosophy for Debian remains mostly the same in that you can have free and open source as their primary philosophy with the option to easily add the other ones. Debian, of course, is not the best for a brand new user. You usually have to do media codecs completely separate. It's not it's well documented. It's just not a simple button inside the distribution itself. There are a lot of other issues with it. Of course, you have Arch. Arch is based on a very fast rolling model with a minimal configuration and giving users total choice. Do you want to be the totally free open source only philosophy? Hey, you can do it. Do you not care and you just want your stuff to work? You can do that as well. It all works out great. So Arch is really good if you want a minimal configuration, add exactly the system and services you want, and then have all of the access to the absolute latest software as it is rolling out. That is really what the proposition of Arch gives us. Then we have Fedora / Red Hat. There's been a little bit of movement around in this as Red Hat is purchased by, was it IBM, I think? I think it was IBM. Anyway, they were purchased, and now we see a lot of a little bit of movement and shifting, of course, and how all those are put together. But ultimately, their primary thing is innovation, finding new solutions, primarily in the enterprise area. And of course, Red Hat is the biggest place you get for servers. You have an open source model with a paid service package, which makes the Red Hat model very nice. Of course, the Fedora would be the open source model of that. So you have a lot of innovation. In fact, if I remember correctly, this is the first of the mainstream distributions to really push the concept of an immutable model down through Fedora. Then you have SUSE. There's not a lot of information out there about SUSE's philosophy other than just saying they're focused on enterprise, making things work, and open source. Of course, there's a little bit of topsy-turvy in the Linux world as SUSE has told OpenSUSE, y'all got to change your names. I'm not sure if that's because they went down a political route or if there was something else going on, but you did end up having some breakdown in that where SUSE and OpenSUSE looks like it's starting to separate themselves out a little bit. The next is Gentoo. The only thing I can say about Gentoo is tools. Yeah, I actually read the philosophy pages for all these distributions and preference for this, and it's 3 paragraphs just talking about tools and tools and tools. I wasn't sure if I was buying a Craftsman wrench or installing an operating system on my computer. Gentoo, get with the picture, folks. But ultimately what Gentoo gives you is a from source platform primarily, which is dedicated to the tools you're building it on, which means Gentoo is a lot harder to install. And that's why we joke about it a lot. But when you do have it installed, it runs way faster, runs way sleeker, and has with it exactly what you need without having anything you don't need, which decreases its portability but increases its efficiency, which is why Gentoo is a really good build if you have the time to build it. Also why Google has chose Gentoo as the base by which to use for the Chromebook operating system. Now, of course, there are other ones as well, which we're not going to dip into these because there's not a lot of other distributions based on these, but you have your Slackware, you have your Solus, OpenMandriva, Void, and a number of other ones out there that they are really good independent for their own means, but they don't have with it a lot of downstream use. There's no other distribution I know of which is based on Solus, for example, although it is a good distribution itself. Next, we're going to talk about the downstream value propositions for distributions which are based on these, but not actually these distributions. And so now we want to talk a little bit about the value propositions of having distributions which are based on the ones we've just talked about, but are not exactly those distributions themselves. So of course, why might we want to install some distribution that's not exactly Debian or exactly Arch? Well, some of these, they are easier to install. Gentoo, for example, is known as an absolutely insanely difficult distribution to install. But we have a distribution called Calculate, I think it's Calculate, which is based on Gentoo. It effectively gets you a Gentoo install. Instead of compiling everything from source like a true Gentoo, it does compile things from the binaries. However, it does get you exactly a Gentoo, a system very much like it, which means if you do want to run Gentoo, you like that value proposition it gives you, that one might be a really good distribution to look into. Other ones, of course, Gecko. This isn't necessarily the ease to install. OpenSUSE is very easy to install, but Gecko is kind of like an OpenSUSE that's already configured for the average user. Linux Mint falls under this in the sense that it's easy to install and it doesn't have some of the things that Ubuntu has working with it, of course, based on Ubuntu or Debian, which branch you have. And the other one I put down here is EndeavourOS. This is the one I'm currently using right now. It allows you to install Arch with a very simple GUI with some extra tools to manage your Arch system on top of everything you're doing. So that is actually a pretty good one. And if I, by the way, mentioned some of these distributions, if I haven't included your favorite distribution, that's okay. I haven't left any out for any reasons. I simply am going in and just talking about the distributions, that a couple brief examples. If you do have examples of your favorite distributions that solve some of these problems, go ahead and leave those down below as well and let us know why you would use that instead of the derivative it's based on. The next is a more modern support. For example, Ubuntu is based on Debian, but supports a lot more hardware out of the box and is a lot easier to work with and configure and get set up. That's why Ubuntu was the top distribution for so many years, is because it basically took Debian and made it functionally work on a lot of different computers. Now, how did it do that? It did something that is against Debian's basic philosophy. It installed proprietary drivers to make sure all of your hardware was supported. But some people don't care about that. And I look at Pop! OS as another one on this. It's one of those first distributions to actually allow you to get a system adjusting the microcodes on your processors as well. But that is another one on the list. Another one of these is better tools. The good thing about Arch is it has exactly what you need. The bad thing, it has nothing you don't need, including the things that you don't know you don't need. And sometimes getting the tools to function on there is not as good. This is really where Manjaro comes in. Now, it's not as close to a true Arch like EndeavourOS is, but it has a a system and a suite of tools that is unparalleled. Pomica easily allows you to do snaps or flat packs, toggle them on or off. Same thing with the Arch user repository, toggle that on or off, allows you a nice GUI to install software, allows you a kernel managers, all sorts of things that you might want from your Linux distribution, but are a lot more complicated to get set up inside of a pure Arch base. And so the downstream value propositions for some of these derivative distributions like Manjaro and Linux Mint and Ubuntu and Calculate, Gecko, some of these, there's good reasons somebody might want to use these instead of going back to the root system itself. And so those are some of those things you need to think about. But now we have to ask, why do we actually want more than one Linux distribution? We are going to cover that in our next point. And so now we're going to get into that argument some people have asked about, and this is, why can't we get just one Linux distribution, everyone rallies around that, and then we have the momentum to get Linux to overtake the desktop? And so that is a good question, but the answer is very simple. It is a matter of philosophy. This is, in many ways, the thing that puts Ubuntu at that crossroads, and why Ubuntu pushes this snap packaging system, which you either love it or you hate it, and there's not a whole lot in between. You see, Ubuntu is a popular Linux distribution that a lot of people were familiar with. Some people have come to Ubuntu because they hate the Microsoft operating system, and it's the one Linux distribution they've all heard about. Some people move to Ubuntu because it is an excellent place to develop software. And so we have this crossroads. This means some people are in Linux because they hate the corporate mindset around a proprietary operating system, whereas other people are there simply because Linux is a good development system. So that is the ultimate answer. It boils down to philosophy. Some people are free software purists. This means that they only want free and open source, fully auditable software running on their computer. They want absolutely nothing that could potentially be doing anything nefarious running on their platform. And I can understand that. I am actually not that deep of a purist. I do want to have general control. I will prefer an open source platform over a proprietary platform, assuming they are about equivalent. In fact, even if the proprietary is slightly better, I will go with the FOSS. But if it comes down to my computer will simply work or simply not work, I don't mind if there's a proprietary driver to make things work a little bit better. Although I do more research on my computers to make sure I can run a computer with pure open source software, not worrying about the other software in there. So the ultimate answer to this is we all have different philosophies. Some of us want pure free and open source software. Some of us just want our computer to function and it doesn't care. Some of us are somewhere in between. And I am in the middle. As much as we joke sometimes about Windows or Mac, I completely support that, and I know how to use all the operating systems, although my Mac and Windows is becoming rustier over time. Some people, regardless of those, some people, they want edge software, and they always want the latest and the greatest. Some people say, I really don't want my system to update itself until I'm ready to update itself. I sit in that second camp. I am more inclined to run a Debian-based system because the packages are not going to update themselves and change things, and the whole menu changes. Of course, we did videos recently about Audacity changed a lot of what they were doing. It caused some serious problems in the workflow, and I had to spend hours to figure out how to get around this. I just didn't have the time. So, ultimately we got to it, produced videos on multiple channels to get that guy right. But the point is, I do not want my software to change its functionality. You want to give me a security patch? Great. I don't want you to change the functionality of my software until I have time to make sure everything works and I have a system in place to account for that. So ultimately, if you want the edge type system, you want an Arch-based system by which to constantly roll your software to the latest versions. If you want that stability of never seeing any package changes, you want to stay on a Debian type branch, and that could be free software or proprietary software doing either one of those things. And so that's really where it comes down to. Now, the next factor why we don't have just one is if there is one single operating system, there has to be one single team behind that operating system. And if there's only one of those, then what happens is A, they get a little bit of market dominance, but B, they start abusing the people that are not in agreement with their philosophy. So if one Linux distribution like Ubuntu comes up and they say, hey, we don't really care, we want to have proprietary software, you're going to immediately alienate everybody who wants free software. And so that is really the ultimate reason and the ultimate purpose for it, is that we can't all agree on that, and this is why we need to have different distributions. Additionally, though, it allows for a lot better innovation, as different people will have different approaches into how all these different functions work together. We can come together with various tools which, you know, the Arch system works really great, doesn't have a good package manager, and Manjaro comes out with Pamuk, and now they can share this out, and now everybody can install Pamuk in an Arch-based system, which is a nice, fun tool. Of course, Linux Mint did this recently with the Warpinator application. One of the great new applications to share files on a local network very simply is Warpinator from the Linux Mint. And then, of course, there's web apps, which I'm not completely sure, but I actually think the web apps application originated from the original Peppermint OS. I'm not totally sure about that, but that's the first place I remember seeing it and getting a lot of feedback behind it. Of course, that's now a function that Linux Mint has by default as well. And one of the reasons I use Linux Mint as my new secure banking system is because of that. Of course, Peppermint is what I had used in the past. But ultimately, all this boils down to a measure of philosophy. We can't agree on how we should run our computers at all, and this is where multiple distributions gives us all of the ability that we can all say, hey, at least we're all running Linux, we can have slightly different philosophies, and that is a really good thing. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to talk about having a few too many distributions, and we're going to talk about why that is, what's good and what's bad about that approach. So now we want to get to the issue of having way too many distributions. So a lot of people want to be a distro developer, and so they develop small distributions. Some of it is just as a hobby project, some of it is to see what would it actually take. There's a number of factors which might decide why somebody might want to do one. Now, there is an element of this which is a double-edged sword here. We want to encourage particularly young developers to learn how to develop these tools properly. We really do want to do that. But at the same time, what ends up happening is the market gets flooded with a whole lot of distributions. So if somebody starts looking up Linux distributions, you might find this overwhelming amount, and some of these, they're not very good. Some of these have a lot of other fundamental problems. Some of these are great. You know, it really is a hit or miss here. But the fact of the matter is we do have too many distributions. Now, what should we do? The first thing I think is that we should encourage young developers to develop these distributions. Number one, we do not know which one of these are ultimately going to greatly succeed in the end. The other factor we want to keep in mind is that they might come up with some innovative tool which can be used in the broader Linux community and will be picked up and used by other distributions. But a third fundamental reason is, particularly for the young developers, it is a great way to get out, to bolster your resume, and to do something that's not just something you're doing for college credit. In other words, do something that is actually going to result in having a real, some real work behind your name, some real function behind your name. These are good things to do. So we want to encourage the young developers, but at the same time, if we're trying to create a distribution and we don't have with it all of the QA, all of the teams, all of the people to make a good distribution function right, then we can end up with a whole lot of crap flooding the market, and we want to avoid that by making sure that we are really focusing and prioritizing on the distributions that really bring true value propositions into the Linux world. And so with all that being said, I think it's great to have the smaller unknown distributions, but we should be focusing, I think, most of our time on the bigger distributions and helping support those. If you can work on and package a small distribution, you can probably help direct a bigger distribution. Not that we want to get everything down to one, as I said earlier, but we want to get ourselves down to a manageable amount of distributions which are isolated by their various philosophies that allow the form of innovation that we want for our individual progress. So the double-edged sword here is the developers here that can lead to too many distributions, but it can increase a little bit of the innovation, and we're walking in that line there. But ultimately, I just think we have too many distributions. We need to focus on refining the ones that we already have, rather than getting mad that one tool is missing and building a whole new distribution for that. It might be better just create the tool, test it on a distribution, and then promote it, pitch it, sell it, or talk about it. You know, those might be other options that we would have. So next we're going to ask, you know, what are we supposed to do with all of these distributions? And we're going to address that as our final point in the video. So what are we to do as Linux users here? Well, ultimately, I think what we're supposed to do the best here, let's encourage the young developers to make the best distributions they can possibly make. Do the best they can do, teach them about QA, teach them about innovation, and working well with other teams of people. That would be a great thing to do. And then they can actually use that experience to maybe get a job, or at the very least work on a larger distribution once they have proven themselves a little bit in their own smaller distribution as they go about. But ultimately for me, as I look around and see all these new distributions and new ideas coming out, which are really nothing more than one or two tools and a different theme onto an existing distribution, I'm just going to personally stick with the main derivatives. You know, I'm going to stick to Linux Mint until, for whatever reason, Linux Mint no longer works. I use Endeavour OS. I might make different Arch decisions now if I had to rebuild a system. You know, as I've said before, I might switch to LMDE instead of the Ubuntu-based Linux Mint in the future builds. I don't know. I've looked into those various elements, various ideas. So ultimately, I'm going to keep using the main distributions with huge user groups and support teams behind it, because if something goes wonky, I want to be able to look it up to see if somebody else has already had this, and most likely I'm going to find a solution for what I need. We are going to encourage the sharing of new tools that come up in the Linux world, but ultimately, I'm going to stick to what works without focusing on these little niche distributions that pop up quite as much. Not to say I don't think we should have these other ones. I'm just saying that if your value proposition isn't big enough, what is really the point? And that is the question I think a lot of people are asking as they look at Linux and see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of distributions. If you're new to Linux and you want to look around, I'll encourage you. There's just a few of the main ones. I wouldn't go beyond a top 10 list of anything. You know, which ones might you look at? Of course, we've already mentioned the core distributions. You could look at those: Debian, Arch, Fedora, SUSE, Gentoo, Slackware, Solus, OpenMandriva, Void. Unfortunately, most of these are not super simple for a brand new user to use. But looking at the downstream derivatives, the simple ones, Linux Mint, Ubuntu, Calculate, Gecko, Endeavour OS, Pop OS, Manjaro, Fedora. Fedora might be one of the easiest to use of the core ones. those are the distributions you might look at. Of course, I recommend Linux Mint for new users. I just find it works the best. It's the most intuitive, works across the broadest spectrum of hardware. And ultimately, I think that that's the best place to go for your very first distribution. And then you can experiment with the other ones as you have a little bit more experience and a little bit better expectation about what you should be seeing. So there are the ideas we have about too many yet too few distributions. Let me know your thoughts about these in the comments down below. Subscribe to the channel if you like this type of content, and let me know what you think about the desert environment for this filming. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.